Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cinema Flow podcast. I'm your host, Zach Abdulbaki, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Mr. Daniel Goldhaber. Daniel is a writer, director, and producer you may know from his 2023 film, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which was great, as well as his 2018 thriller, Cam. Daniel is joining us to chat about his new film, Faces of Death, which is about a woman named Margot who works at a social media company as a content moderator. She basically has to flag and remove any content that is violent or explicit. She comes across a series of videos that appear to feature real killings and decides to investigate them to figure out who's behind all of it. The film features a stacked cast including Barbie Ferreira, Dacre Montgomery, Josie Totah, Jermaine Fowler, and Charli XCX. The film will be released in movie theaters on April 10th, and it's super scary and entertaining. I highly recommend that you all check it out. Now, please welcome to the show the co-writer and director of Faces of Death, Mr. Daniel Goldhaber. How you doing today, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, doing well. First off, thank you for taking the time. I saw the film yesterday and I thought it was great. It's super engaging. I was completely invested in Margot's character, and I had never seen the original Faces of Death. So, to everyone out there listening, you don't need to see the original to watch this movie. You can just go in blind, it stands alone. I was wondering if you could talk about how you got involved in this project and where the inspiration for the story came from, because I heard that you once worked as a content moderator for a social media company, but that was on IMDb, so you never know if these things are true.
Yeah. No, it is. I worked for a social media startup that some friends had when I was in my early 20s, and it was a very small company. It was not one of these kind of big corporate endeavors, and especially in the early 2010s, what you would find, I learned, is that if you had a small little social media startup and you just go up on the App Store, the apps would very quickly become colonized by trolls and people who wanted to post child porn or videos of death, because they knew that these small startups didn't necessarily have super robust moderation divisions, and so my friends were kind of like, hey, do you mind like helping us just like monitor the feed and take this stuff down? And so I worked doing that, and it struck me that that would make for a very fruitful world to set a thriller in.
I want to ask you a nerdy question because one of my favorite things about this movie is that it was shot on 35 millimeter. I love the vibrant colors and the natural grain on screen. It looks like a true 70s horror movie. You previously shot on 16 millimeter for Pipeline, and then you also shot on digital for Cam. So I was wondering if you could tell me about your conversations with your cinematographer about why 35 was the right choice for this movie.
I mean, 35 was quickly, I mean, it's exactly as you said, like stylistically, we had also seen this movie as kind of a throwback to 70s and 80s slashers and thrillers, everything from blowout to The Conversation. A movie called Targets was a huge inspiration for us. And I wanted a film stock that would actually capture that effectively and kind of authentically. And it's actually something I had wanted to shoot Cam on 16 millimeter as well, and I we just weren't able to afford it. And the thing is that I was always also interested in kind of this idea of blending film stock with digital image, kind of blending 35 millimeter film texture with the image of kind of these kind of cut-ins that you have where you kind of go inside of the screen when the character themselves is having a digital experience. And that I feel like just creates a really interesting juxtaposition for the audience, right? Where they're kind of experiencing the real world with this like very like textured, grainy, film stock, and then the digital world kind of intercedes and kind of breaks it up in a certain way. Yeah, it was actually that kind of juxtaposition of cinematic textures that, on some level, was what was so exciting and interesting to us.
Absolutely. It looks incredible, and it was exactly the right choice for this movie. I heard that you guys are going to premiere the film at Beyond Fest in Chicago with the 35 print. I'm curious if you and the folks at IFC have had any conversations with like the Vista Theater or the New Beverly Cinema about showing the movie on 35 millimeter, because they've done it a few times for new horror movies like Together, Keeper, Strange Darling, and Cuckoo.
Yeah, I think we're going to absolutely. I think we have a 35 millimeter screening at the Arrow Theater.
Cool.
That's one of the ones that I'm familiar with. But I definitely, the hope was to really keep a 35 millimeter release of the film going as long as we can.
That's awesome. I can't wait to see it again on the big screen, like on 35. One thing I noticed about you is that you're a true film buff, which isn't the case for every filmmaker. Your Letterboxd account has over 4,700 movies logged, and you made lists for the movies that inspired Cam and How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Are you going to make a list for Faces of Death? And if
Yeah,
so, what are
I
some movies that might be on that list?
I posted it maybe 25 minutes ago. 43 minutes ago, it went up. So I'm happy to talk about it. Funny that you should ask. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of just it's a blend, as I was saying, of stuff, from the 70s and 80s, like, Blowout or Portrait Henry of a Serial Killer, or, Targets. And a few older things like Peeping Tom, but then kind of movies that I think deal really interestingly with kind of textures of the internet and contemporary life, like Cachet and Funny Games and Unfriended Dark Web, Pulse. So that was always kind of the two things that we were joining here were this kind of like old school thriller vibe and this kind of contemporary look at the internet and digital life.
That's awesome. I got to go back and I've seen a couple of those, but I got to go back and like look at that list and really dive in. One more thing I want to ask about your cinematography is that I believe you have a different aspect ratio for this movie than How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I believe that was taller, like 1.78 to 1, and then Cam was 1.85. Was this one 235 widescreen or uh,
2-2. 2-2 is an aspect ratio that my cinematographer Isaac Bauman is very passionate about. He's gotten me 2-2 pilled, I would say, because it's about as wide as 235. You get the feeling of this kind of like you know. Widescreen, very cinematic experience. But it is combined with like a slightly taller vibe, which I think can kind of just lend just honestly a larger image size. So, 2001: A Space Odyssey was 2-2. I believe Nope was 2-2. A lot of really great films were 2-2. It's been making a comeback as of late.
One more thing with your cinematography, I love the split screen that you used in the movie. And I also love the Dutch angles when Margot was at her computer after getting fired. So were you inspired by any Giallo films or any or like where did the ideas come for like the split screen and the Dutch angles?
Yeah, I mean, for the split screen, that was really a De Palma inspiration. I think that I was always thinking about this movie a little bit like kind of the kind of like De Palma-esque style exercises that he does, and so I thought it was really interesting to. I also, when we were structuring the movie, again, we were very inspired by the structure of Targets and by this kind of like, dual structure where you're going between kind of like predator and prey and watching them kind of slowly get closer to one another. And I thought it was very interesting that like as we're watching them get closer to each other, the ways and the kind of cinematic language that we use to show that gradually develops, right? So the first time you go between Margot and Arthur, it's with a dissolve, right? And then the next time it's with a match cut. And then the next time it's with a split screen. And then when they finally do collide with each other, it's with this kind of like oneer where they're actually connected in the same shot. And so I just thought also, just from a kind of a stylistic challenge perspective, that it was really fun and really interesting to kind of watch two characters cyberstalk each other simultaneously.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was very thoughtful. And now when I rewatch it, I'm gonna get to really pay attention to that. I was about to mention that tracking shot. I really loved the production design in this film, and that tracking shot where except to Margot's house, I have to imagine was done on a soundstage because of how the camera moves past the walls and everything. It's very technical. And I was wondering, was that on practical locations or sound stages?
Yeah, no, we actually did the oneer in a practical location. We built the entire apartment building building, or like we built the apartment hallway into a building,
I see.
with a kind of a flyaway wall. Yeah, and so that's actually a guy's house. Margot's apartment building. It's like just a dude lives there, and we built the apartment into that. And then as for Margot's apartment, I mean, yeah, like, you know, she actually doesn't have a lot of history. She's somebody who has on some level been, uh, she's cut herself off from her old self and her old life. And, you see some of her history in her apartment. I think with Arthur, we really wanted to dig into this kind of like suburban isolation that I think I experienced growing up in Colorado. In the backyard of a lot of mass shootings like Columbine, the Aurora Batman shooting. These were things that happened very close to me. I knew people at the Aurora Batman shooting theater. And I think that there's something that we always felt about the kind of suburban alienation of those spaces, that was that makes this kind of like desire to connect through violence feel almost inevitable. But I think there's some other little Easter eggs about Arthur's house, and it's a house that he, I think, inherited from his parents, who died, or maybe he killed them, who knows. And but I think it's also interesting, like ways to dig into like other forms of Arthur's radicalization. So I think for eagle-eyed viewers, they will potentially spot a Hitler painting hanging in his garage, which to us, I think, is a little bit of a clue as to how he's thinking and what victims he's choosing.
Yeah, I believe there's a line from Faces of Death that you included, which is violence is his only means of dealing with reality, which really freaked me out because, I think anyone could end up like Neil or Sammy if, God forbid, we encountered the wrong person. So, what were your conversations like with Dacre Montgomery about crafting this character? Because he's truly terrifying.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that what I was really excited about with Dacre, and when I cast him, is that a lot of other people kind of approached this character who I met with from the standpoint of like this guy that they had seen in the media, this other person. And I think that what Dacre immediately brought to the table when we met was the ways that he sees himself in Arthur, and his own relationships with OCD, with loneliness, with alienation, all of that. And basically, for me, I think that I find it very interesting when people say that Arthur has no motivation, because I think it's, to me, very clear what his motivation is, which is he's seeking attention. He wants to be revered as a great filmmaker. He wants to succeed at content creation. He wants attention, and that's kind of what we all want, and that's why we all post. He's just trying to hijack the algorithm in his particular way.
That's true. And he does have that great monologue at the end about like the attention economy. I guess he doesn't have like a particular beef with certain victims like Sammy or Neil, but yeah, he does have like a reason for why he's doing all these crazy violent acts. And the way you crafted his character is amazing with his look and the glasses and the voice when he's stalking Neil, and then later with the red eye contact. What was it like creating the like costume design and look for him? Because I think he's going to be very iconic now, especially with that mask as well.
For us, it was, a couple of the key things are that, Arthur has this kind of like very theatrical style to him. He's very performative. He's thinking about his own sense of iconography, right? So it's like he's choosing a mask that he knows is going to be iconic, you know? And I think at the same time, Arthur is somebody whose connection to the outside world is always mediated through the internet. So basically, everything in the movie that you see that Arthur has is stuff that he buys on Amazon online, So you can kind of see like lots of boxes of his Amazon purchases in the background. And so I think the mask is just some cheap thing that we found online that we kind of converted into something.
Yeah, no, it's very like it feels very contemporary in that regard, but also timeless. Like I think it's you did a great job of like bringing this type of story to the modern day. I want to talk also about Barbie Ferreira because she's great and she has this great quality in every movie I see her in where you just want to root for her. I really loved her in Bob Trevino Likes It, but I think this might even be her best performance. What was it like working with her, and why was she the right person for this role?
Yeah, Barbie's great. And, one thing I really love about her is that it just feels like such a familiar and kind of authentic person on screen. Like, I think, one thing that I struggle with about some contemporary actors is just that, like, there's just a sense that this is a model, that this is a person who, like, kind of exists to be in front of a camera and nothing else. I think, Barbie is gorgeous and charismatic, but she still has like such a specific face and quality, and she just feels like a star in this kind of old way of movie stars to me, which I found really exciting. Um, and I think that for when it came to like, you know, this role, she's really somebody who I think grew up on the internet in a very similar way to me and Issa, and who I think had experienced the also at times the horror of, what happens when the internet turns against you and the depersonalization of that. And I think that, it felt like there was a real personal angle that she could bring to the character.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. You also have a great supporting cast, including Josie Totah, who plays Sammy, the social media influencer. I thought she was
Mhm.
great because she made the social media pretty girl very human. She didn't feel like stereotypical. In fact, I honestly felt for her character more than anyone in the movie. So shout out to her. What was it like working with her?
Josie's great. And I mean, like, I think that that's the thing is it's funny that like on some level everybody is a little bit of an influencer these days. You know what I mean? And I think that it's something that should be very easy to understand because, again, the part of the point of the movie is that, we are all participating in this, cycle of violence on the internet. And I think, for Josie as somebody who also grew up online, I think it was really about just like tapping into her own desire for, again, kind of, I think, to be seen on the internet, which is, one of the key themes of the movie.
Absolutely. And she was actually in the same class in film school as I. So it was always
Oh,
fun
no
seeing her.
kidding.
Yeah, I'll reach out to her folks for interview maybe because I'm always happy when she's in a big movie like this. Um,
Yeah.
you also have Jermaine Fowler in this movie, who is really great in the movie Sting, which is a spider horror movie from Australia. He plays Margot's boss at Kino, the social media company, and I thought he did a good job representing the dystopian late stage capitalism mentality that a lot of these companies have. He says, give the people what they want, which I appreciated because really at the end of the day, these companies just go where the money is. So if people just wanted to watch funny cat videos, that's what the algorithm would feed them, but they don't. People respond to negativity more than anything. So what were your conversations like with him for him representing that sort of theme in the movie?
Yeah, I think it was very much. I think Jermaine is just a great comedian. I think he really tapped into just I think just playing somebody who just doesn't care, who's sitting here wielding on some level quite a bit of power, cultural power, um, and who decides to kind of abdicate a sense of responsibility from it.
Yeah, definitely. Also, a horror movie would be nothing without great visual and practical effects. And it's an interesting challenge because the effects have to be so good in this movie that the characters have to authentically believe that these are real deaths happening on screen. So, how did your effects artists take to that challenge, and how much of it was practical effects versus visual effects?
What's interesting is there was one effect in this movie that actually the studio really pushed me to do for visual effects, and we could not get it right. And I had kind of always had a feeling that it was not going to be feasible to get this effect right with visual effects. And we had to actually go back to pickups and reshoot it practically to make it look good. I think with most of the effects, if not almost all of the kind of blood effects in this movie, they were done practically because ultimately as good as visual effects are, as good as AI is, I think when you're actually looking closely, your eye still knows the real thing.
Definitely, 100%. It all looks amazing. I noticed in the credits that it says a film by Daniel Goldhaber and your co-writer Isa Mazzei from Cam. And it's usually that the film by credit is reserved just for the director. So why did you feel it was important to credit both of you? And what was it like writing the script with her?
Yeah, I mean, we just built the movie from the ground up, and I think it's interesting. Like, film is such a collaborative medium; it's such a team sport, and it feels like it really should never belong to the director just by themselves. And I think for me, I've always been interested in kind of thinking about authorship in the movie in a slightly different capacity, But I think for me and Issa, it's just really it's a talking process. It's a lot of just going back and forth and sharing inspiration, and one of us takes a draft at something, the other one gives the feedback, tries to push them further. And yeah, it's always a very organic process with us. We've been doing it for a long time.
Well, you guys are great together, and she's also listed in the credits as Narcan Girl. Is that a cameo? I gotta go back and
Yeah,
find
yeah,
it.
it's a girl that is given the Narcan information that Barbie moderates out of the movie. That's Issa, a little walk on.
I want to also ask you about your score. It felt very 70s and 80s, and I like that you knew when to use it, but also when to use silence to let the tension build up. I'm curious as to what your conversations were like with your composer, Gavin Brivik, and were there any scores that you referenced as inspiration for what you were looking for?
I actually at this point I cannot remember what our inspiration scores were. So I finished this movie 2 years ago. I actually haven't watched it in 2 years. So there's certain things I just don't quite remember, funny enough. But it's funny with Gavin, it's also a very kind of additive process. He creates a sound. I like it. We use it in the edit. We kind of go back and forth building the score in the edit as he's scoring the movie. And in terms of the silence, I think, we'll often like score every part of the movie, and then, our sound editor, Michael Odmark, will be in the mix, and he'll be like, no, take the score out, lose it here, lose it here, more silence, more silence. And then sometimes those are decisions that you're not even making until the final mix.
That's cool. And also, Charli XCX is in this movie in a small cameo. I forgot to mention, what was it like working with her? Because I've also heard that she's a big cinephile.
Yeah, she's a huge cinephile, and this was actually her first professional acting job was in this film, which was really cool and fun. But yeah, she's just a consummate artist. She can really do it all, and she I think was just very excited about the story we were telling here, and I'm so glad that she is a part of the movie.
Also, what's next for you? I read on Deadline that you sold a thriller pitch to New Regency. Is that still happening? And in general, do you know what your next film will be?
Yeah, I'm working on a few things. I'm working on this Regency thing, which I'm very, very excited about. And I am also working on a project set in the world of techno music that I've been working on for some time. So, hopefully we get these put together soon.
That's awesome. I hope to have you back on the show when those come out. Lastly, do you have any advice for young filmmakers? Because a lot of my audience is a bit younger, like film students and up-and-coming filmmakers. So, do you have any advice? Because your story is kind of inspirational with Cam and how to blow up a pipeline, and now this.
Make movies with your friends, and I think don't hesitate to call yourself a filmmaker. I think that's something I just see people do sometimes is they feel like they haven't earned being a filmmaker yet, and so they're like waiting. But you just gotta call yourself a filmmaker and go for it.
I agree. That's great advice, and I want to thank you, sir, for taking the time to do this episode. I hope that everyone goes to watch Faces of Death, which will be playing in movie theaters on April 10th. I'm going to take my friends to see it on opening weekend because it's awesome and very thoughtful. It's just a great story overall. So everyone, get your tickets now. And before we wrap up, where can people find you on social media if they want to keep up to date with everything you got going on?
At Chrono Pictures.
Awesome. I'll put a link to that in the description, and hopefully people don't spend too much time on social media, but still keep up to date with Faces of Death and everything you got coming out. I assume it's going to come out on Shudder later, right? Because IFC and
Yes, I believe so.
yeah. But they should all go see it on 35 millimeter if they can, and if not, just a good old AMC.
Yeah, see it in theaters,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. Well, thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of the Cinema Flow podcast. We'll be back next week with more fun movie chats. But until then, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.